The inspiration for this video came out of my video about the relative difficulty of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. I was reviewing the edit where I was talking about the distance between the Firelink Shrine bonfire and Capra Demon Fog Door, and it got me thinking about how the early areas in all of the Sekiro Soulsborne games are designed to introduce new players to the mechanics and broader design philosophy of From Software's games. I mentioned that in the same video that From has a lightness of touch to its tutorializing that borders on the perverse, and the more I thought about it, the more I found myself compelled into thinking further on the way From tutorializes its games. This series will consider the first 3 Souls games, how they introduce the player to the variations on what might be considered to be the core mechanics of the From games, and perhaps most interestingly how successful each game is in bringing the player through their monitor and into the digital worlds produced on the other side of the screen. With each game I'll provide a walkthrough of each of the tutorial areas, explain what I believe is trying to be taught to the player at any given moment. To conclude, I'll take a broader view encompassing the 3 games as something of a cohesive whole and compare and contrast the successes and failures of the tutorial sections of each. As I've begun work on this project, I've realised that it's become a piece of work that is perhaps too large for someone new to my channel to engage with in 1 hour-long video. I'm going to release 2 videos then, the first dealing with the commentary and walkthrough of the tutorial areas of the Dark Souls games, the second dealing with the in-depth analysis and critique. I should at this point make it clear that for this set of videos I'll be talking about the Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin edition of the game, released about a year after the original, described as not just a remaster and almost recreating the game by the Dark Souls 2 global producer Atsuo Yoshimura. The Scholar of the First Sin version of Dark Souls 2 makes numerous changes to the game, including how multiplayer works and technical improvements. The changes that are particularly relevant here are the ones that tinker with enemy placements in almost every level in the game. I haven't played the original Dark Souls 2 game, so I'm unable to comment on the changes personally, and besides, talking about the differences between the 2 editions and the subsequent impact of game mechanics is not the subject of this video. I merely mention it here so that it is clear what version of the game I am speaking about. With that caveat made and the broad structure being explained, let's get started. Like the best fantasy, Dark Souls 1 opens with a player creation screen. Players can choose a name for their character, change their class, customise how they look, etc. Choices that will not be alien to anyone who's ever come across a fantasy RPG in their lives. Once they are happy, they are treated to an introduction cinematic complete with overwrought narration, dragons, flames and prophecy. The camera creeps along a dingy dungeon corridor and settles on the player character. A glowing corpse falls from a hole in the ceiling. A knight in armour who looks suspiciously like the character from all the press releases surrounding the game looks down on them from above. The player assumes control, probably working out the camera and movement controls for themselves in the room that they start in. They learn that glowing orbs in the game represent items that can be picked up. Picking up this item from the corpse gains them a key to the door to their cell. A long corridor beckons. There are some hollow enemies here that will never attack the player and won't defend themselves if they are attacked, allowing the player to learn the combat controls in a stress-free area. There are developer messages on the floor in the form of glowing orange writing that tells the player how the combat controls work if they haven't worked it out for themselves, while at the same time telling them that the world will be full of such messages that might pass on helpful information. Through the bars on the right hand side is a monster in a separate area making very obvious crashing noises as he walks around. Drawing the player's attention this way tells them that this will be an area that the player will be able to access at some point. A pool of water at the end of this corridor tells the player that walking through bodies of water will slow their movement speed. Up a ladder and the bonfire mechanic is revealed to the player for the first time. Through the massive obvious doors ahead, and the player is ambushed by the Asylum Demon, the first boss enemy in the game, though I use the term boss with heavy air quotes. The game wants the player to run away from the demon here and through a door to the left, but I'm not sure what players are necessarily going to realise this initially. In fact, I think that the game is banking on them not realising this. For the first encounter, the game wants the player to give the demon a few whacks with whatever weapon they have to hand, before hopefully realising that this isn't the way forward at this time. They're probably going to be whacked themselves by the demon's massive club and sent back to the bonfire. It's a teaching moment. The player realises that death isn't game over, and that they will have multiple opportunities to fight enemies. They also likely learn about bloodstains, that upgrading weapons is a good option to consider when fighting an enemy who's much stronger than them. Finally, when the player does eventually discover the door at the side of the boss arena, it shows them that living to fight another day is just as legitimate a tactic as standing and fighting. Down the stairs off of the Silent Demon Arena is the game's second bonfire. A long, narrow corridor with an archer at the end awaits. The archer is firing at the player, and a glowing orb catches their eye and draws them into a room where they can hide. A shield is picked up and the player is given a way of blocking the archer's attacks, as well as being taught how to switch weapons in the inventory screen. The player charges at the archer, likely with their shield raised. The archer runs away and the player picks up a new weapon. Following the archer, the player is given the opportunity to kill this enemy with their new weapon, likely with one hit, and are shown how much more powerful they are relative to the hollows outside their cell, who took several hits to be put down. Through the fog door, and the player emerges into an area above the first bonfire outside the Asylum Demon Arena. The character who you saw peering down into your cell at the beginning of the game is in a room ahead of you, well illuminated by a shaft of sunlight. A journey up a flight of stairs ambushes the player with a rolling ball, which doesn't kill them, teaches the fact that their attacks will be unexpected, and knocks down the wall into the cell with the knight from earlier. He tells you that he has failed in his mission, but asks that you carry on in his stead. We are told to travel to the land of lords and ring the bell of awakening to learn our fate, and given our first source of healing, an Estus flask, and a key that opens the locked door at the top of the stairs with the boulder. Leaving his cell, the player can unlock the door behind the boulder, but will likely go down the stairs if they are at all inquisitive, and unlock a shortcut back to the first bonfire. Through the locked door, and the player is given more messages about combat mechanics that they can use on the hollows ahead. 2 enemies attack one at a time, and then an archer enemy is around the corner, whom new players will likely approach with their shield raised. Leaving the fog door alone for a moment, we go into the final new room, and are taught about parrying and given a lone enemy to practice on. A locked gate in this room is the second reminder that perhaps this area might be somewhere to come back to at a later point. Through the fog door and the rematch with the Asylum Demon, though with the tables turned as you face him with new weapons and more experience with the combat mechanics. A message outside the fog door tells players about plunging attacks, though they will probably work this out themselves even without reading the message by falling off the ledge and spamming the attack button. From here it's a straight duel. The demon's attacks hit hard, but they are slow and easily predictable. The arena is relatively large, giving players plenty of space to get behind the demon and attack him from there. Defeating the demon nets the player a key that opens the door at the far end of the boss arena, and some humanity, an item that is never explained to the player. We enjoy a calm victory stroll and another cutscene. The narration refers again to the prophecy hinted at by the knight in the undead asylum, and the visuals heavily imply that it is the player character who is the subject of that prophecy. A giant crow appears, and we are spirited away to Lordran and Firelink Shrine. This ends the tutorial for Dark Souls 1. I know people are going to have issues with this. I promise I will explain myself in the next video. For now, I will run through Dark Souls 2 and 3. Continuing on in the finest traditions, Dark Souls 2 doesn't begin with a character creation screen. The introduction cinematic shares Dark Souls 1's overwrought narration. There was once a great kingdom, there are dragons in that kingdom, one day you will stand outside the gates to this great kingdom without knowing why. The language is vague and heavy with symbolism, as is the imagery. The cutscene ends with a fall into a swirling whirlpool, a metaphorical descent into darkness. The player character awakens in a ruined temple and the things betwixt, and shown the way forward toward a jagged shard of light. There is no character creation menu, no options to choose your class. You are dumped weaponless in the world and left to make your own way. The opening area is wide and open, designed to give the player plenty of space to work out the movement and camera mechanics for themselves. There are no signs on the floor giving tips, no on-screen messages, just a large circular area. The player heads towards the light up a small incline and into a smaller area. A cottage is illuminated with golden light up ahead, but if players are anything like myself, they will explore the entire area before heading forwards. There are a handful of dogs running around. They do not attack you, but give the player the ability to experiment with the lock-on controls. On the far right side of the arena is the first glowing orb. The player will encounter a rusted coin, and, if they are not careful, are long fall to their deaths in a return to the ruined temple. Carrying on towards the welcoming light outside the cottage, the player emerges into a smaller area. The way ahead is across a bridge, but again, players are likely going to make sure that they haven't missed anything before heading over it. To the left is a hidden path between some rocks. Some large footprints are embedded in the path leading upwards. Around the corner, and a huge mole-like enemy appears. You cannot sneak past him, and I imagine that most players will chance their arm against him to see how much damage they can do. The answer is not much, and they will probably be eaten to death. The ruined temple beckons again. The player returns to the wooden bridge and heads over it toward the cottage. On a ledge below and just to the left is the second glowing orb, a smooth and silky stone. This is the game telling the player that items will be shown, but they'll sometimes have to work out how to get to them. If the player ran past the mole monster, they pop out in the same point as they would have done if they had crossed the wooden bridge, illustrating that the game will have alternate paths, but they will end up in the same place regardless of which one they take. With every path explored, the player heads into the cottage for some more context. A second cutscene plays. A room of red-clad women speak cryptic platitudes into the room, but they often watch more concrete context for the world and the player character's reason for being there than almost anything else in the game. We are an undead, cursed, and not the first person to have crossed their paths. We are told that we will go hollow and prey upon men, feasting on their souls. We are asked our name, given an effigy, and finally introduced to a character creation scene. With that done, we are given a final cutscene, which is about as close as the game ever gets to directly telling the player where to go, what to do, and what will happen. We are told that we have arrived in the world to break the curse. We are told to hold on to our souls as they are the only way to keep from going hollow. We are finally told that no matter what, we will lose our souls, over and over again. The scene ends as the camera spirals towards the ceiling, laughter ringing in our ears. We resume control of our character inside the cottage. We can head up the stairs and open our first chest to collect a second human effigy. Leaving the cottage reveals the game's first bonfire. There is a cart which can be destroyed for a torch and some souls. A stone in the middle of this area tells the player to rest at bonfires and light torches. Heading forwards leads to the second half of the tutorial area proper. A winding path ahead reveals itself with unlit torch braziers dotted here and there. But beyond lighting them and making the environment brighter, I'm not sure what the use of this tutorial is given how rarely it is useful in any other parts of the game. Fog doors await on either side of the path, and any players returning to the series from Dark Souls 1 will be instantly suspicious, but we are a long way from anything resembling a boss fight at this point. Let's go through the first fog door on the left. A stone tablet tells the player what button they need to press to attack, knowledge which the player probably acquired within 10 seconds of gaining control of their character in the Things Betwixt. But it is useful because it specifies the button to use to attack with a right-hand weapon, implying that you will be able to attack with a left-hand weapon as well. The next stone tablet shows players how to lock on to targets and switch between targets while locked on, something which, again, players have probably already worked out for themselves with the dogs in the meadow and the Things Betwixt. There's only one hollow enemy with which to practice this new technique in this area, the player probably having killed the first one already, but we will return to this. A third stone tablet tells the player how to dash forwards, and as before, I think you are beginning to see a pattern form here. I'll save my thoughts on this for my actual analysis of the tutorial section as a whole. I'll continue referring to what each tablet tells the player as we reach them, but suffice it to say that they invariably pass on information that the players already learned for themselves. Heading forwards, and the player emerges onto a small cliff overlooking a beach with another of the mole monsters from the Things Betwixt. They probably have a weapon in hand at this point, and remembering their likely defeat from earlier, are looking forward to having their revenge. To the left, a hollow is standing with his back to the player. A stone tablet is nearby, but the player probably doesn't bother reading it and goes straight to attacking him. If they have a weapon and are not trying to Rocky their way through the game like I am trying to do here, they will execute a special attack with a new animation, dealing a huge amount of damage to the enemy and likely killing him outright. For completion's sake, the player may read the tablet just to see what it says, and it tells them exactly how to do what they just did. Let's put a pin in it and move on. Up the path, and a dagger lies glowing on the floor for those players who chose to start out as a deprived character. A stone tablet tells players how to roll, and I am excluding this particular piece of tutorializing from what I will talk about in the next video, because the hollow enemy ahead has a bow, and teaching the player how to roll at this point also teaches them that it is possible to avoid our attacks by rolling out of the way, or as in this case, through them. The only other tablet in this area teaches players how to switch between weapons, which likely hasn't been possible until the dagger was picked up just before entering this area. The next stone tablet tells the player how to step backward, as well as presenting them with the first combat encounter with multiple enemies. There is a life gem in this room to pick up, but like the way the game treats all the other items in the game, there is no tutorial telling the player how to use it or what it does. Chances are that at this point the player has taken damage and can do with healing, so this omission is confusing, especially given the pains the game has taken at this point to explicitly explain mechanics that the player in all likelihood worked out for themselves. Pin in it, let's move on. Through the fog door, and the player character emerges onto a ledge high above the main area they stepped into earlier. A stone tablet tells them how to move the camera. Voices emanating from the large nest to the left tells the player to give them smooth, yes, give them silky. If anyone manages to draw the link between an item picked up earlier and the instructions that this nest is giving them at this point in the game, then I am a pork pie. The player kicks down a ladder and we return to the main path. A soul of a nameless soldier lies on a ledge that can be dropped down to from the ledge with the nest, along with a tablet reminding the player to light sconces with the torch. Back on the main path, the player likely heads through the second of the fog doors. A stone tablet tells them that they can hold their weapon with 2 hands. Skip the next stone tablet because you probably already know what it wants to tell you, and move on to the third in this area, which presents the player with a gap in the path and tells them how to jump. Leap over the gap and pick up an amber ember. Leaping back over the gap and a ladder reveals itself just to the left. Climb it and a set of tablets tell the player how to execute plunging attacks from above, parry enemies' attacks and break enemies' guards. Drop down in the hollow beneath you, hopefully more successfully than I manage in this clip, and read the tablet telling you how to execute a jumping attack. Exploring this small area presents the player with a fog door and a regular door behind which lies a cracked red-eye orb. Passing through the fog door returns the player once again to a raised walkway in the main area with the path running through it. The end of the walkway looks into a section with a new frog enemy hopping around in it, but at this point you can't enter it either by jumping from the raised walkway or through the third fog door just off the main path because a stone statue is blocking your way. You are given no hints as to how to get past. Having explored the entire area, there is only one more path to follow, straight ahead down a narrow, craggy path, introducing the player to the mechanic whereby players can leave messages on the floor that can be read in other games. Carrying along down this path leads to Majula, the hub world of Dark Souls 2, the equivalent of Firelink Shrine in the first game. There are no prizes for guessing how Dark Souls 3 opens. After a character creation screen, the player is shown a cutscene of their character climbing from a coffin, the souls falling from their body like dust. They stand in a forgotten cemetery. Headstones lit the environment like teeth crowded too close together in a particularly filthy mouth. The tutorial messages from the developer, like in Dark Souls 1, are immediate, written in the familiar orange text on the floor. The camera controls and basic lock-on mechanics are tutorialized, and the player is given their first enemy to try them all out on. A glowing orb is down an alleyway to the right, teaching the player that exploration off the beaten path will be rewarded. Returning to the main path forward, a brand new mechanic is introduced to the player in the form of the Ashen Estus flask, though typically it is not explained. Backstabs are introduced and an enemy is placed nearby with his back obediently turned toward the player. A ranged enemy is introduced and plenty of space is provided for the player to dodge their attack or raise their shield to block it. Nearby, the first multi-enemy encounter is introduced, as well as the idea that enemies will not always be up and wandering about when you first encounter them. Further on past these two enemies is a route flooded with deep water, teaching the player that their movement speed will be slowed depending on the terrain they are moving through. A message here tells the player to turn back, almost certainly having the opposite effect and driving them onwards towards an enemy that, for completely new players to the series, will be very difficult to beat. Even experienced players will struggle with this monster as they get used to the new pace of combat after Dark Souls 1 and 2. It's Dark Souls 3's version of the first Asylum Demon encounter in Dark Souls 1 and the Mole Monster encountered in Dark Souls 2. It's a teaching moment. You're not supposed to beat this enemy, you are supposed to die to it and learn that death is not game over, and that there will be enemies that you will have to return to at a later moment to defeat. Returning to your coffin, you fight your way back through the enemies and emerge from the cemetery. It's a brilliant moment, like emerging from Vault 101 in Fallout 3, a moment where the game unfolds before you that hasn't been seen in the series until this point. Look at all this, the game is saying. Look at what you have to look forward to. This reveal serves a second purpose in terms of level and world design, but we'll return to that in the next video. The game's first bonfire is here, and a message nearby tells the player to rest at them to restore HP and Estus charges. The opening out of the level opens up a variety of ways that the player can move through it, though all of them ultimately lead to one point, so I'll try and cover each enemy in this area. Down the incline ahead is a lone enemy and two more to the right that are sitting down in what I will call an inactive state. Continuing around to the right is another lone enemy before you are ambushed from behind, teaching the player to be ready for attacks from all directions. Continuing along this path leads to two enemies with a dead end and a precipitous drop to the right hand side. It is an introduction to several things at once: the first enemy with a shield and spear, the fact that you will have to manage ranged and close-up attacks at once, and that space management will be important in terms of survival. Back to the bonfire and straight on where you turned right to kill the two inactive hollows. A message teaches you how to jump and places a glowing orb on a coffin below you. If successful, you collect a Titanite shard, your first upgrade material. The plunging tutorial is next, with an enemy obediently waiting before you, though like the 2 games before it, Dark Souls 3 rarely designs in the possibility of utilising this mechanic again. A final ranged hollow enemy doesn't cause any troubles before the player moves into a wide open area that absolutely screams boss fight. Within 5 minutes of booting the game, you're given a spike in difficulty, and unlike the Asylum Demon, there are no tricks here. It's just you, your sword, and Iodex Gundyr. This is a brilliant fight and a brilliant design choice, but I'll go more into this in the next video. At this point, the game is testing what you have learned and also teaching you that some enemies will have phase changes as they take more damage. It's also a thematic tease for some of the enemies in the next area. Killing Gundyr rewards the player with the usual on-screen message when you kill a boss. The game does introduce another new mechanic here, the idea of embers. At this point, players may notice that their health bars got larger and that their health has been fully restored, but I wouldn't want to make any guarantees that many or even a majority of players notice this. Pin in it. The only way forward is through a big set of double doors, as in the case of the Undead Asylum. The environment opens up again where it narrowed at the entry of Gundyr's boss arena, and the eye is drawn upwards towards a castle on the top of a hill. Like the area on the other side of Gundyr's arena, this area sprawls and has multiple paths that ultimately lead to the same place. The player will likely pick up a homeward bone, which will allow them to warp straight back to the earlier bonfire to heal, as after Gundyr that is a very likely possibility. Arriving on the far side of the ravine, the player can look back to where they were minutes earlier and look up at the giant castle above them. The player has encountered most of the enemy types here already, but they are clustered closer together, and so likely the first time the enemy may have to fight 3 or 4 enemies at once. Exploration will introduce my least favourite enemies in these games, the yapping, frenetic undead dogs. Collecting an ember in the area with the undead dog will teach the player that restoring embers is not restricted to winning boss fights, and can in fact be done at will. I said earlier that the maze-like paths in this area ultimately lead to the same place. That isn't strictly true, as exploration reveals 2 separate paths that at this point are blocked using the game's 2 main gating techniques, powerful enemies and keys. As with the ice crystal monster earlier, it is the game's way of telling you that there are areas that you may have to return to later in order to proceed. Through the archway and down the only path open to you at this point, returning players will be treated to a shot of nostalgia, Firelink Shrine. They embed the sword that they removed from Gundyr in the centre of the shrine to create the hub bonfire, and the area that the player will become very familiar with as they play throughout the game. It is to Dark Souls 3 what Majula was to Dark Souls 2, what Firelink Shrine was to Dark Souls 1. Level up with the Firekeeper, maybe upgrade your weapon with Andre the Blacksmith, have a chat with Hawkwood. There is no progress from the Firelink Shrine, it is apart from the rest of the world. Rest at the bonfire and warp to the High Wall of Lothric, where Dark Souls 3 and the critique part of this video begins. Hi guys, thanks for watching to the end and being patient enough with me to allow me to be a bit self-indulgent by splitting this video in 2 and making it into a series of sorts. I did finally decide that it was needed though, as I really didn't think anyone would look at an hour-long video by a guy with 6 subscribers and think that it was anything that they would want to spend their time on. I'm hoping that 2 videos will help to avoid this, but it also has a happy side effect of allowing me to develop my ideas further and allow me to better able to structure what I'm going to say. The second part of the series will be out in about 2 weeks. In the meantime, I stream on Twitch every day and my Twitter link is in the video description. Once again, thank you for taking the time to listen to what I have to say. Subscribe, make a comment, engage with me in any way you can. I'd really appreciate it. But that's enough talking from me. I'll see you next time.